Hey everybody, I am hoping this works. This is like my 5th time to try to record a video for you guys, and I keep losing internet. So we're going to try it again and see if it works. All right, so our first word is myofibril. All right, so myofibrils are going to be, there's going to be a whole bunch of them in one single muscle cell. All right, so just to kind of recap, a muscle cell is also called a muscle fiber. Now, inside of that one muscle cell, this is a muscle cell right here, are going to be hundreds to thousands of these little myofibrils, which are basically a muscle fiber. Okay, it's kind of what myo stands for muscle and fibril for fiber. But anyway, they're going to be thin, very small, and they're going to be basically composed of a couple different proteins called actin and myosin that we will learn about here in a few minutes. And they are going to be the contractile units, or have the contractile units for muscles to be able to actually contract and move. All right. So these little myofibrils right here is one. Okay. And you can see it has multiple ones right here in this one muscle cell. And then if you look at this, we kind of took it and zoomed in. These little purple ones, I guess you can call them, those are going to be myosin, and then the green ones are going to be something called actin. Those are different proteins that are going to work together to make the muscle contract. And so you can kind of see how those are scattered throughout the myofibril. The second word is myosin. So myosin is the thicker protein that is going to work with muscle contraction, and you can kind of see it here. And then it's got these little heads right here, which is going to be the next term called a cross bridge. All right. So on this red strip here, that's the myosin, and on the myosin you have cross bridges, which is basically these projections or heads that come off of the myosin. Now, why those are going to be important is because those are going to latch onto another protein called actin, and they're going to pull the actin towards the middle here, which is going to make the muscle shorten, and that's how muscles contract. Okay, so these cross bridges, these heads on the myosin, are going to grab the actin, and they're going to make the muscle contract. All right, so actin is the one that kind of looks like Mardi Gras beads. That's the best way I can explain it. They are 2 layers basically of these beads, and this is the thinner protein that we call it, and that's going to be used for muscle contraction, I should say. And this is going to be the one that's going to bond with the myosin and these cross bridges. It's going to grab these little beads right here called actin, and that's what's going to pull it to the middle of the muscle, I guess you could say, or aim towards the middle of the myosin, so we can make that contraction. All right. Now, on the actin, there's going to be a couple different proteins. So the first one is called tropomyosin, and tropomyosin is going to be this one that looks like a rope right here. Okay, so you can kind of see it right there. And what it does is it blocks the binding sites on the actin. So earlier I told you that those cross bridges are going to grab the actin and kind of pull it and move it to the middle. Well, if that tropomyosin is on there, the cross bridges can't, there's nothing for them to bind to, so they can't make the muscle contract. So this tropomyosin kind of blocks the binding spots, or, you know, the actin binding spots there, if that makes more sense. And so we'll have to get those out of the way. And we're going to do that because troponin right here, the little red spots, I guess you could say, that is another little protein. And it is actually what holds the tropomyosin in place. And so troponin, these little red ones, they are going to have to bond with calcium. Okay, so calcium is going to be needed for muscle contraction. And when calcium gets released, it bonds to the troponin. And then what happens is troponin now pulls tropomyosin out of the way, and it reveals these actin binding spots. So now those cross bridges are able to grab a hold and pull the actin and cause a muscle to contract. So there's a lot to it, as you can tell. You've got the myosin and the actin, which are supposed to work together, but now you've got troponin and tropomyosin that are kind of blocking everything. And so until we get calcium to cause a muscle contraction, we can't have anything happen. All right? So the contractile unit itself is called a sarcomere. So kind of from blue line to blue line, in this picture it's called a Z disc, but on our vocab it's going to be called a Z line. But basically that's kind of each end of the sarcomere is the end of the contractile unit. And what we're going to have is the red ones here. I know we've got different colors everywhere, but the red one is actin, and the green one here is myosin. Okay, so remember, if calcium is present, we now have those actin binding spots available, and the myosin will grab the actin and it will start to pull it towards the middle from both sides here, from both of these blue lines, and it starts to move it towards the middle. Okay, so this sarcomere, you can see this is what it looks like. excuse me, what it looks like when it's relaxed, and then this is what it looks like when it's contracted. So you can see these reddish ones, the actin, they're much closer together than they were here when the muscle was relaxed. So a sarcomere can shorten, of course, when the muscle is contracting. The next term is called the H zone. All right, so this H zone is this middle part right here. So we just talked about the Z lines, which we'll talk about in a minute. But and then right in the middle here where the myosin is, that's the H zone. Okay, now what that is that's where the contraction is going to take place. The myosin is going to pull the actin over it or across it, and that H zone is going to get smaller. Okay, so it provides the space for the contraction, if that makes sense. So the Z lines we kind of mentioned already. Those are going to be, each end of the contractile unit or each end of the sarcomere. And that's actually where the actin is going to attach to or kind of begin, I guess you could say. And then, so those Z lines right there hold the actin in place. And then the myosin grabs the actin from each side here and pulls it into that H zone. The next term is called a triad. Tri means three. So this is going to be three major parts, and then these are going to help with the muscle contraction. So the three parts are going to consist of a T-tubule and then two what we call sarcoplasmic reticulums. All right, so what does that mean? All right, so T-tubule is going to be this channel or canal looking thing right here. Now what happens is when we're talking about skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means that we control it. We say, hey, muscle, I need you to do something. And so there will be a nerve, okay? There'll be a nerve up here that sends a signal to your muscle, all right? Well, what happens is that causes what we call an action potential, and that sends it down this T-tubule, okay? Sends a signal, I should say, down the T-tubule. As that signal is coming down, these little purple things on each side of the T-tubule, those are called sarcoplasmic reticulum. You've probably heard of endoplasmic reticulum. Well, in the muscle cells, sarco means muscle, and so sarcoplasmic reticulum, their job is to hold calcium ions. And when that signal comes through the T-tubule, it tells the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium ions. When those calcium ions get released, remember it bonds with troponin, pulls tropomyosin out of the way, allows myosin and actin to bond together. So this triad is really important because it sends the signal, lets the calcium ions out, so we can actually have a muscle contraction. So I told you sarco means muscle, and so sarcoplasm, you've heard of the term cytoplasm. Well, that means, the fluid inside the cell. Well, sarcoplasm is going to be basically the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. So the fluid and organelles inside of a muscle cell, if that makes sense. All right, so as you look at this picture, this is that motor neuron I was talking about. We'll explain that a little bit more. And here is one cell. Now, inside of your one cell, you're going to have what we call sarcoplasm. So this light purple color right here, that is all that fluid or filling within inside the cell. So we call that the sarcoplasm. All right, so there's going to be some different terms that we'll hear as we go. Sarcolemma is like the plasma membrane of a cell, of a muscle cell, I should say. All right, so this somatic motor neuron right here, this is a nerve cell. And remember I told you that muscle cells are voluntary. So somatic actually does mean voluntary control, motor movement, neuron, nerve cell, okay? So a nerve cell that transmits impulses to a skeletal muscle. That word just kind of makes sense. Now, how this happens is, of course, our brain sends a signal and goes down the motor axon, and then we have these little neurotransmitters called acetylcholine. Now, inside those little vesicles, that acetylcholine will get released through exocytosis. So if you remember, exocytosis fuses with the plasma membrane, opens up, and spits out the contents, okay? And so these acetylcholine will travel through what we call the synaptic cleft, and they'll move to it, and they'll go to the muscle cell, and there'll be receptors on the muscle cell. The acetylcholine will bond with that, and there's a little bit more to it, but then eventually we're going to send this signal down that T-tubule, which tells the sarcoplasmic reticulum to let out the calcium ions, which then allows the myosin to grab the actin and create a contraction. So these somatic motor neurons are going to be super important for voluntary skeletal muscle. All right, so those were your words. I hope that that makes sense. Some of these other little pictures that we see are going to be, just kind of just to review some of those terms. This is a very similar picture to what you guys did the other day with the licorice activity. So you got one muscle cell, it's covered by the endomysium. You've got a bunch of those muscle cells, a group of them called a fascicle. It's covered by a paramysium. And then all those fascicles together makes up the whole muscle or the whole organ, and that is covered by the epimysium. All right. So anyway, just kind of remembering that. And there's one more picture I want to show you. Here we go. And so this is one muscle cell again. Remember, skeletal muscles is multinucleated. And remember, they were striated? They're striated because of the actin and the myosin, which are in these myofibrils, these small little protein fibers that are inside of one cell. And those lines that you see in the striations, that's because of those sarcomeres that we're seeing. Okay, so I just think that's kind of neat. So you can kind of see what's going on. I hope you guys have a good day, and I hope this time it works. All right, talk to you soon.